Richard Lloyd Parry of the Times. The Japanese government has been fairly clear in demarcating these dual evacuation zones around the plant, 20 and 30 kilometres. But at the same time, it's obvious that many people in Japan are taking precautions far more extensive than those. How adequate do you think the Japanese government's evacuation areas and publicly recommended precautions are? And following up on that, one of the concerns some people have seems to be that the full information about the extent of radioactivity either might not be available to the government or might not be revealed by the government. Is it possible that that is the case, or would inevitably other people be able to detect what was really going on?
Yeah, it's an important question. Several parts. I mean, the first issue, I guess, is evacuation zones. I've just been through them on my way up to Fukushima. The designation of an evacuation zone is obviously an arbitrary decision. I mean, nothing magical happens at 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers. So you're always measuring the ambient radiation level. You are deciding what would be the delivered dose over a certain period of time. If you remain there for 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, and then you are deciding what is your tolerance for radiation exposure. Different governments have different tolerances for radiation exposure to a population. And as we all know, the United States government has reached a rather different conclusion than the Japanese government. In my opinion, because these things are arbitrary, I don't have a problem with the designation by the Japanese government. I mean, there's no scientific basis to accept or reject 20 kilometers versus 30 kilometers versus a radio area, because the dispersion of the radionuclides from the accident are global. I mean, they're everywhere. So, so now we're just talking about, they're in California, they're in New York, they're in Europe. So it's a global northern hemisphere. Our colleagues from Australia will be happy to know it's strictly a northern hemisphere event. But it is global in the northern hemisphere. So where you choose to draw the line is completely arbitrary. It was quite easy at the Chernobyl accident because we had a exposed reactor core, so that we had a constant source of radiation emissions. We could measure the radiation levels 4 kilometers away in the town of Pripyat, for example. We knew that that radiation level was not going to change very much because the reactor core was just exposed. It'd be like standing in front of an X-ray machine. And we could quickly determine that if you stayed there, you're going to get in trouble. And so out everybody went. But our choice of a 30-kilometer exclusion zone was rather arbitrary. So I don't have a problem with it. I do think we get into problems when different governments give different advisories, because then the people who are in the intermediate areas get concerned, and they have questions about whether their government is hiding information or is willing to accept greater risk to the population than other governments. So that's problematic, just as the designation of different action levels for food and water contamination by different governments is problematic. But I think one thing I'd like to say, which goes along with your question, is that we should remember these decisions are made on the basis of populations. And this is a difficult concept to get across, but they're population-based. They're not individual-based. So generally speaking, one takes all the members of the population, one identifies the most susceptible people, for example, infants, and then sets a limit on what you can accept for the entire population based on conservative estimates of the most susceptible person. Now, if you're 70 years old and you smoked cigarettes all of your life, and you live 15 kilometers from either Chernobyl or Fukushima, is that a sensible decision for you to evacuate as opposed to the population? No. I mean, you are not going to encounter, look at your cumulative radiation dose up to that moment, your imparted risk from cigarette smoking, et cetera, is the amount of radiation you're going to get from one of these exposures, is that going to change your probability of getting cancer? No, not at all. You know, so I think so. But you know, we can't have the army going around house to house and taking a medical history and checking people's age and asking what's your risk tolerance. And so you have to make these rather arbitrary decisions that sometimes adversely affect people. I think we all know that there have been several deaths from people unable to get health care or unable to get medicines. So you're trying to make a sensible decision. You can't consider the individual, you have to consider the population. You know, are you going to be able to deliver food to isolated pockets where people want to remain? Are you going to be able to deliver water? Are those people going to eat food that they grow on their land? And so with all of these things, you know, in the hopper, I think it's choosing 20 or 30 kilometers is rather arbitrary. It's quite reasonable, in my opinion, quite reasonable.
So the second part of the question, would we know if
No.
the truth wasn't coming out?
Probably not. At least I certainly wouldn't. So, I mean, we have to accept, I mean, I went there with a Geiger counter, not so much to check on the Japanese government's or Tenko's, you know, information, but rather just, you know, to get a handle on what was going on. But you know, what can a few observations mean in the context of constant monitoring? But you know, I have no way of. I have to accept their figures as being true. I think, to some extent, the opposite. Putting aside some mistakes that have been reported in radiation levels, but fundamentally, it seems to me that the problem is in excess of information, not a paucity of information. People are, you know, people are just tremendously confused by a bunch of experts who say that the water level is 300 becquerels one day, and then it's 75 becquerels the next. And people just don't know what to do. What does that mean? And they assume naturally worst case scenario then, and that's not appropriate. So we can have, you know, too much information. I'm not saying information should be withheld, but it needs to be processed, and that was one of the suggestions that was made to the Prime Minister's office, that this minute-by-minute reporting of data is not helping the public appreciate what are the radiation risks.
Steve Olson from Stars Response. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Gale. Jason Gale from Bloomberg News in Singapore. As a physician coming here, what questions do you have for the doctors that you're meeting who are caring for these workers? And secondly, as a follow-up, what kind of epidemiological studies would you like to see done on the populations affected? Maybe serological studies, epigenetic studies, that kind of thing.
No. Are we related? We have the same.
I don't think so.
We have the same name. Well, with regard to the medical care, I guess is the first issue. And I guess the focus of your question is on people that would receive a high dose of radiation, because those would be the ones who would need some medical intervention. Well, I mean, there's substantial disagreement, I could say. You know, at the lower level, we all understand that you know, we're sort of starting our thinking at a dose of about a sievert per mercury, or 1,000 millisieverts. But so that's where the biological effects, you know, the biological effects start at every photon, but that's where the medical effects started, where you start thinking about playing hardball. And I think there's no disagreement that observation and supportive care and judicious use of antibiotics and in some instances antiviral drugs, because exposure to ionizing radiation activates herpes viruses that we all carry. And so one of the problems we faced recently is activation of these viral infections, which then complicate the treatment of these patients. And that's something that can be readily prevented. So up to that point, I don't think there's any disagreement. At the next level, where the bone marrow starts to be adversely affected, blood cell counts start to go down and things of that nature. Again, I think we're all in agreement that molecularly cloned hormones, or called hematopoietic growth factors, but that would be a situation where the risk would be very modest, if any, and the benefit, you know, could be substantial. So I guess there's agreement up to that point. And then we reach, I guess, the most critical stages where you think that a person's bone marrow has been, which, you know, is producing all these white blood cells and red blood cells and platelets that we need to survive. You think that either that's been destroyed, which actually never happens. There's no dose of radiation that can completely destroy your bone marrow without killing you for other reasons. But it can be so severely damaged that the amount of time it would take for the bone marrow to recover exceeds the amount of time we can keep that person alive. So what do we do in that instance? And that's where we get into controversy. And there are vested interests. One possibility is we use some relative who has the same genetic type, which is typically referred to as HLA, or human leukocyte antigen. That's the major genetic locus that determines transplantation between people. So some people have said, well, we should be HLA typing all of the workers. So we could look amongst their families and so forth and so on and see if they have a donor. And then there's another camp which agrees with that, that says, well, we have stored on computers around the world something on the order of 17 million volunteers who have had their HLA type determined and have said that they are willing to donate bone marrow. So we don't have to do anything, but we could have the HLA type of the workers, and then we could look for prospective donors and not activate it unless it was required. But sometimes finding these donors, you know, and getting them, so it could be difficult. So there's another camp that has stored away these what are called umbilical cord blood cells. So these are cells obtained from the umbilical cord of children being normally born, and they're HLA type, and they're frozen in liquid nitrogen. And so they're sitting there. We don't have 17 million, we have something more like a million or so globally. But they would be just sitting there in repositories. And if you knew the HLA type of the workers, you could just defrost it instead of having to run around trying to locate the donor. But there's a final camp which says, well, we should be collecting what are the equivalent of bone marrow cells, which are, if you give humans certain hormones, the ones I mentioned, these bone marrow cells come out into their blood, and then if you put them on a gigantic centrifuge for a couple of hours, for a couple of days, you can collect these bone marrow-like cells, and you could freeze them away. And then if someone gets into trouble, you would have their own bone marrow cells. And that would be, that would be ideal in a certain sense, because that couldn't be rejected and it couldn't cause other complications of bone marrow transplantation. So all of these camps are representing special interests, and each one of them is pushing the physicians at the reactor site. I met with Dr. Yamaguchi, who is the chief physician for monitoring the health of the workers, and he's under tremendous pressure to do something, and particularly under tremendous pressure to collect and freeze away blood cells that are the equivalent of bone marrow cells from the workers that might be exposed. And at the first examination, that sounds quite sensible. Why wouldn't you do that? I think the problem is that we've calculated as best we can from our prior experiences that the likelihood that you're going to use those cells is probably less than 5%. It might even be less than that. So you would take 100 people, give them these hormones, put them on a machine, you have them out of action for a couple of days, and you might or might not ever use. There are risks to that. I mean, they're not horrendous, but there are risks to that. And then you would maybe use them in 1 or 2 or 3 people where it was critical. I mean, we never really know. But I think, in my opinion, and then you have another consequence, which is if people are know that my blood cells or bone marrow cells are stored away, I'm going to accept a higher level of risk. So I can be cavalier about being exposed to radiation because I have these frozen cells. But, well, that's not appropriate, firstly. If we knew who was going to be exposed to higher doses of radiation, what we ought to do is prevent it. I mean, we're always better off preventing exposures than treating exposures. And it doesn't mitigate the other potential risks that you mentioned. It doesn't mitigate the likelihood that you might get cancer in the future or things of that nature. And it doesn't help with the other problems of high-dose radiation, which are damage to the gastrointestinal system and damage to the skin. So, although Dr. Yamaguchi is under huge pressures to do things like this, he is reluctant to do so, and I encouraged him to remain reluctant to do so, because I just don't think that the risk-benefit ratio, which is the calculation for us, for any medical intervention, what's the risk, what's the benefit, is just not favorable for that kind of approach, although it sounds great. And people have even suggested, why don't we extend that not only to the workers, but to the entire population that could be exposed in tens or hundreds of thousands of people. Well, in that scenario, I can guarantee you that you're going to cause more deaths by doing that than you are going to save lives. So I'm sorry for the long answer, but it's a very important issue. And then the other question was, should we be doing epidemiological studies? Well, we've done gigantic, multinational epidemiological studies of the Chernobyl accident, which was in magnitude substantially greater. We do have this tragic thyroid cancer problem of 6,000 or so thyroid cancers, but that is, I think, going to be largely preventable here. And this large epidemiological study has not shown any detectable increase in cancer amongst the Chernobyl survivors. So I think it would be, it would not be productive at this moment. Things can change, but it would not be a productive exercise. When you do it, people always say, if you don't find anything, they say you're hiding something, or it's just not a thing. And it has one further unanticipated consequence, which is to stigmatize the people that are involved in it. So they have to go, say, for annual health checkups. They get some sort of a card. And they kind of, you think that, well, I must be at risk of some bad event. Why would they be screening me? And then other people say, well, I wouldn't like to marry into a family where one of the people is being followed for radiation damage. So we face this issue in Israel when many Russian immigrants came to Israel from the area of Ukraine, and we tried to decide should they be screened specially or should they be just part of the normal population. And I think quite rightly it was decided that the benefit of screening them, picking up cancers early, et cetera, was outweighed by the adverse consequences.